So now it's 4 o'clock. It's Wednesday, so therefore it's time for this week's Got-IT Talks. With me today is Irmgard Wetzstein, and thank you very much for joining us for this week's session. Tell us a little bit about your research. Why are you working in communication? And I mean, the topic for today is, of course, how to communicate risks in health digitally. So, how come you are working with digital health and communication?
Mhm. So the more general question first, why do I work in communication? This is really a tricky question for me because I just actually ended up there. I always thought that communication is really the fundamental basis for everything. Things don't work without communicating, without starting to talk about it. You cannot identify problems or whatsoever, find solution without communicating, without bringing people together. So I have always been interested in media communications, of course, but also interpersonal communication. And as such, I have to be interested in online communications because this is where debates take place. On the online sphere, the digital sphere has been so important for debating about the most pressing issues in our lives, like for everybody. It's not like the only platform, but it just has become very relevant and important. And one of those pressing issues, of course, health. So yeah, this is why I just have to deal with that.
Which also is quite interesting. I mean, digital health is often described, of course, as a tool of the future, but that interpersonal debate, that's a very classical type of communication that's just moved to a new type of platform. Would you say then that that is also part of the fascination? I mean, that echo of both, well, millennia of debates between people now just stuck in a new type of platform.
Yeah, I think the online communication. I think it's about tools, of course, but it's not only a tool, like a means for communication. It really generated also a whole new way of approaching each other, obviously, because suddenly there is, for example, a screen in between. On certain platforms, you have the opportunity to talk to each other anonymously. So let's say that correctly. So we can stay anonymous, which can be an advantage, which also has a lot of disadvantages, of course. So I think that really changed a lot. And in academia, we call this the mediatization of like the public, of society even. So we have to deal with that because online, the digital sphere, online communication really has been like penetrating all of our, or most of our lives and most social areas. And so um, even people who maybe are not that digitally literate, who are not able for some reason to deal with digital spaces or are not involved in that, even they, I think, can get an impression of how important it has become and that they maybe miss something. So even them, it affects even those people. So we just cannot ignore what is happening in digital spheres, in also regarding digital tools, because that is such a complex and huge topic with so many aspects. So we have to deal with
Hmm.
that.
I can't help but wonder also maybe when 500 years ago, when people maybe started using written form as a form of debating in newspapers or similar, maybe not 500 years, but using books certainly to do that. Maybe that was also sort of the same. Suddenly, that morphed communication into a new sphere where people didn't understand. Some didn't understand. Some found it fascinating. Some found it scary. Some found it um, well changed. It changed a lot of power also between people. But fascinating. So you've been researching this particular field for how long, or did you come from another? You said that it was maybe by chance in a way.
Mhm. Yes, I
So.
mean, with online communication or with like dealing with the digital sphere, like in a very broad sense, I started in 2013. And before
Mhm.
that, I uh, did exactly, or yeah, exactly what you described. I dealt with like this more one-way communication of journalism. So, which was not, which was very high threshold, so to speak. So with social media, for example, with social networks, we have now a very low threshold of opportunity also, not only to communicate something like in a one-way direction, but also to if they are exploited in that way, to use social media in a very dialogue oriented way. So maybe this is something that could be quite new also in also for health communication. Then it's not only about like doing campaigns, for example, or doing journalism like for a very widespread, like very diffuse public, which you cannot really define,
Mm,
like for the mass public, but for very targeted audiences also, and then also get into contact with them. So that would
mm,
be the potential I see, for example, in social media. And that is also what changes things in the communicative context then. So.
mm. To we'll talk about the more general learnings from that in a while. But talking about an elephant in the room, um, digital communication about health has certainly in the last 18 months or so had a lot of focus. Um,
Mhm.
how have you has that just generated more research for you to do, interesting cases, or have you seen sort of a shift or a morphing of I like
Mhm.
the word morphing today, but a shift in that have we started using it significantly differently than before? What's your take on our learnings
Mm.
as either as a culture or as individuals?
I think regarding research, of course, like the pandemic has produced a lot more research questions. For now, also regarding digital spaces and how we communicate in digital spaces when it comes, for example, to digital literacy, when it comes to people not being able, or some people not being able to differ fake from facts, for example. So I think we have a lot more research questions now regarding the pandemic, also regarding then in context to the digital sphere. But I think that all those circumstances we are talking about regarding digital communication have been there before as well. So they have become more visible, maybe, like also social imbalances have become more visible within the pandemic. And so I don't think the developments we observe at the moment, like uh, fake information, things like that, that they are new, but they just become more visible. So I think this metaphor of the pandemic being like a magnifying glass for like everything becomes visible even more, and it also becomes visible that things just really affect people. It's not abstract. It's really like in a very practical way. So I think that's the case. But what happens faster, I think, is or what we have seen that also with much pressure had to happen faster is digital transformation processes. So there was a certain pressure behind it, and that just that accelerated a lot. There's a lot of dynamics there at the moment. But I don't think that those things haven't been there like before, that they're completely new. We just see them more directly.
Hmm. All right. But as an acceleration, then um, what have you then discovered that would different about the needs? I mean, um, the infodemic based on a lot of misinformation, a lot of high rates of information, um, but also maybe a slight change or reliance on information because people, well, they were stuck at home. They consumed more information than they were used to. Um, maybe then that might be one of the fundamental shifts you see, that people would continue to rely on other sources of information more because they now see different ways of using the digital media, or being maybe more also uh, um, media literate from the experience. Is this actually just a huge benefit for media literacy across the world? 18 months of crash course.
Mm. I think one has to learn digital literacy like from scratch. So whenever I do third mission activities in that regard, like media competence, media literacy, also visual literacy, um, I I'm very convinced, and I always say that you have to learn that from scratch, like it's cool, for example. Um, this is nothing. I think this is nothing you can just you just can throw people in, like say, okay, and now deal with it, and you will find your way somehow. Because as you mentioned, the infodemic, there is just too much information, or very much information is basically good, but there is just very much information out there, and it's also not very well structured for us, for our brain, I would say. So one has to digest that somehow, and there are just so many platforms, so much opportunity. There is not only like the classical mass communication and journalism context anymore. There's so much more, and to find some orientation, and also to get some sort of feeling what, for example, information source is like professional, especially in a very sensitive topic such as health. I mean, that affects every one of us. Um, so I would say that it's just not enough to say, okay, now we have that situation and deal with it somehow. Here are the digital tools for it. Of course, we
Mm.
have them, and of course, I think uh, people who had to work with it, for example, got a lot of practice, and people also like me, for example, learned about also limitations then obviously of digital tools. And I'm convinced that they can be very valuable in many ways, but that the personal contact and personal communication and meeting people like really face to face is also a very important aspect. I mean, in the health communication context, for example, a social bot cannot do psychotherapy,
Mm.
for example. I mean, there are certain, uh,
Not very
I,
effectively,
I,
anyway.
I mean, maybe, but I'm not aware that this, I cannot imagine, maybe I'm wrong for like in 30 years, but I cannot imagine that this would work also for people like getting an algorithm reaction or something like that. So I think we can learn a lot from it, but we cannot learn digital literacy like from being thrown into a completely new situation without maybe or just without knowing what to expect. So
Mm.
there is a certain learning effect, I'm sure about that, but I don't think that questions such as, I mean, digital literacy is not about like what button should I push on a certain
Mm.
platform. For me, it's about what should I do with the content? How can I reflect on that? How can I double check if that is a certain
Mm.
information? Where are the facts from, and so on? And this is I think very just hard to learn when you're just thrown into all that. So.
Mm. Well, then, if you'll forgive me for asking two questions in one, and I'll try to remind you if you we're off. Um, the first of the two would then be what can we then learn as either providers of information, be that via apps or websites or so on? How can we learn to do that differently, given that people are well, not as literate as they could be, even though they have a lot of training. And the other part of the question would be, what do you then think would be the right format? If we can't use the sink and swim mechanism, what should we do instead?
I think like learning digital literacy is a question of training, structured training, which should start in a very early age. That would
Five,
be,
five,
yeah,
6, 2, 1.
yeah, school age, I would say. As soon as, actually, as soon as, I mean, I'm not like an educator, but I would say as soon as children actually get in contact with digital media, and that is very early. So
Mm, certainly.
yeah,
Mm,
that yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, um, I have a very young daughter, for example, and she knows exactly which buttons to push. If I give her my smartphone, she knows, okay, this is YouTube, and here I can start a video, like my sing a song, sing along videos, and so on. So, okay,
Mm,
but she has no idea what what content she's actually, for example, confronted with, for example. So this is really a question of training, I would say. This is not something very intuitive, but it is a question of training, and also a question of asking the right questions. Where does my information come from, and so on. So
yeah.
that was the second part of your question. And what was the first one?
Yeah, I mean, to my experience, daughters have always been extremely good at knowing which buttons to push, but that perhaps in a um, but the second part, I suppose, was on the side of the developers or the providers of the
Mhm,
information. Uh, in this particular case, of course, in the Got-IT Talks perspective, we are developing the guideline for the
mhm,
developers. And in that sense, of course, we're talking about people doing an app or a website or a service of some kind. But information providers, whether that's authorities, newspapers, all kinds of providers of information, they should, of course, also take learning from those same points.
mhm,
And while what you just described, of course, would be the mechanism to help the individuals to build the capacity to survive in a modern world. Sometimes the modern world also needs to adapt to its users. I guess.
mhm. Yeah, for like developers, I would say, hmm, first of all, I think it's important to provide information in a very structured way. So think of a structure in which before you provide the information, before you like put it online, just think of a structure of what is important to people. Maybe there is research before that, like requirements, questionnaires, or whatever, what people actually don't know and want to know. So provide those answers in a very structured way. That would be the first like recommendation. And the second one would be, um, I mean, technology and the technical part of it is very important, obviously, but digital health is an, I would say, interdisciplinary area. So it's not only a question of how can we like implement things technically, so like the technological layer of everything, but also what people's needs and requirements, for example, what do they actually have to know, what do they want to know, how can I also, and this is a maybe more yeah uh, social scientific approach, then also asking how can I address people, how can I target them regarding the information I have, how can I really put the information out there, not like with a like scattergun principle, what like mass media would do, like, or I don't know, have some kind of posters like over in the whole city or so. So you would reach a lot of people with that. A lot of people would see it, but you don't have any control what people. So you don't have any like targeted communication. Then this is what online media digital tools could do. Like think of who you would like to address, think of how you would like to address people, and also use the channels maybe that those people are already using. So go there where the people are, like in the digital sphere in that case. And the second thing would be that I think it's very important to monitor what is happening online, what is happening in online debates, for example, and that's a lot. So one could use, for example, media intelligence, media monitoring tools, for example, because there's just so much data out there you have to make sense of that cannot happen only manually, obviously, but still you need resources, also human resources, to work with that data then to make sense of it. So it cannot happen fully automatically, I would say. Or maybe you don't get a lot of information then. So you need also really the resources if you want to work like in the digital field. You need also the resources because it's a dynamic field. It doesn't work from 9 to 5. It's just always there. So to really react very fast and you just need also the people to work in that field.
And what you then describe here is this I mean, do you find then, based on those observations, that that is also sort of the baseline of quality that you see, or is that more the ideal that you would hope for? Um, I mean, are our media really good at doing what you would hope they did?
Well, speaking of social media monitoring tools, for example, like social media analytics, um, I think there are very helpful tools out there to monitor what is happening on Twitter or wherever. I mean, depending on where you would like to go. So there are really good solutions already. But they are expensive, first of all, maybe not for companies, but for individuals like startups, that would be quite expensive to have such a tool. And then they still need some sort of people checking on those tools because, for example, sentiment analysis and so on sometimes are not that reliable. So still you have to have people who also check what is actually analyzed there and see
Mm.
to what extent this is also reliable, what is analyzed there automatically. So it's
Mm.
helpful, but I think there's also a lot to do in that field still. So we're not like at the end of the road with that. But I think as such tools can really well complement, for example, the work of market researchers. It could also be helpful to monitor what is happening regarding the conversation, the online conversation about health issues, for example, about, I don't know, vaccinations, for example. So, and see what are actually the topics that are discussed and that need to be addressed very fast. So for that, that could help, I think.
Um, as you say, startups would have different resources available for what they do, and larger companies we've seen. Last week, I suppose, Facebook, even though they have all the resources in the world, still they seem to be struggling a little bit about how to actually also do good with all those resources at the same time. Um, uh, is it without being dystopian? Is it actually realistic to expect these organizations to be able to do that within the current market model?
Mm, I think, I mean, I don't know what happens inside Facebook or Google or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Oh,
where I think they're quite intransparent in many ways. Um, but I think it's necessary to hold them also accountable. Um,
hmm.
but that is a question of, I don't know, policies
Well,
and so on.
well,
So,
one element is of course accountability, but thinking in a more constructive mindset. How can we establish maybe better conditions for these startups that yes, they don't, oh no, they don't have the resources, but would there be ways that we could somehow improve the ecosystem for them? You think that would generic tools that would help them, more generic guide? I'm sort of using the word guideline here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Using, what would you suggest would be sort of a um, ways of improving their conditions to do what we would like them to do, and maybe, of course, we could consider whether the that big tech could use some of those same basic tools as well. As you say,
Mm-hmm.
they're pretty intransparent, so it's hard to tell exactly what they do, but they do strange things at least.
Yeah, it's very hard for me to have an answer to that question, to be very honest. But I think a lot of is happening as well. So we have to recognize, acknowledge that as well. That I know certain false information is also banned more restrictively than it has been in the past, for example. So especially in context to the pandemic and information about, I don't know, vaccination and so on.
Mm.
But I would say the question is what questions or what question we would like to have answered. If it's about um, like producing some sort of digital tool or guidelines for health communicators, then this is a bit a different layer, I would say, as just communicating through Facebook, for example. So this
Mm.
could be, I mean, one element could be, for example, I don't know, having some sort of Twitter live stream or so on, but that's only maybe one element of that digital tool, or like monitoring, but that is Facebook pages, but that is only public Facebook pages then maybe, but that is only one element of what such a digital tool could do, for example. So that could have a lot more elements than I would say, but not. But I'm not into your Got-IT project. Like I'm not so
No,
much
no,
not
that's
involved in that. But I
that could
guess you
be
would have
the
a
other guidelines and tools as well. I
yeah.
hope.
But I guess you would have a better idea about what could happen there. Better ideas about that as me, because you
Hmm.
work in that project. So yeah, I would also be very interested to hear about that at some point. To be honest.
Well, you will. Um, don't worry. As long as soon as we can, I suppose. But um, coming to then, especially the communication of the risks, and maybe also what you've sort of alluded to a couple of times about the veracity of what you communicate. It has been, I guess, debated from time to time about the fact-checking mechanisms, and that people should be fact-checking what they say or do. And if you had a fact-checking mechanism, someone could do that for you, maybe having a fact-checking panel, maybe. But how do you then, in your mind, there's this can easily be something that can evolve into also what would worry some, and to censorship. How can you have that completely sort of um, freedom of communication if there's also the need for someone to control you?
Um, I think it's of course important to have some sort of control about who uses like very powerful digital tools, like monitoring tools, and also for what they are actually used. Um, but I would make a distinction between wrong inform things that are just wrong and like a different opinion, and let's collect opinions and have a discourse about that. I think those are really like two very different things. So as long as I think we have room for different opinions, for like discourse, for constructive discourse, then everything is fine. So, but if like also powerful people, for example, use tools to distribute obviously wrong information, like the opposite of every like fact we have, then I don't know. Then I just wouldn't talk about censorship, to be honest. I
Mm.
mean, it's obviously a question that has to be like reflected from like in every case, like individually. But I would really make that difference because um, yeah, because I think when we have the scientific evidence, for example, about certain circumstances, then this is the information we have at the moment that can be discussed. That can be, I don't know, every theory can be at some point like um, be questioned, but there has to be a certain discourse about it.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and then there is
Well,
this really like wrongful information. And
mm.
yeah, I would really make that difference, to be honest. But I don't
Well,
have a final answer to that. So
no, well, well, if you had, that would be very nice. I think you could then distribute it to the world, and that would be it.
yeah,
Um,
close the research area and that's it. But no.
yeah, yeah. But we've certainly seen, I mean, both Facebook, Twitter, some of the big media that again had the resources, really been struggling to find that balance at times, without mentioning another elephant. Of course, that they really had a challenging time in how to make sure that the truth, the fact checking was there, and without wielding, I suppose, their power, that could lead for them to be thought as the new censors of information, which is a tricky thing. So I guess if they are struggling, of course, lesser startups are struggling too. Um, but
I think
so some of the,
transparency is really important. What
mm,
what the big like tech companies like yeah don't do so
yeah.
much in many cases, but I think transparency is really important. Where's the information from? Where are those numbers from? Who did the research? What interests do lie behind those results? Maybe is it like from an
Mm.
independent research institute, or is it um, like numbers that a company published on their own behalf, or whatever. So I think those are the important questions, and so I think transparency is
Mm.
at least a start. Yeah.
But for a smaller startup or health information provider, of course, that can be more tricky. Would the key elements for them then be just to be extra careful with the links they share, or that they only should share links from public authorities, or what are some of the key learnings that you would say that they should take heed of when they share information?
Mhm. I think that depends on the maybe also on the special topic. So it's a very, but I try to imagine it's a very abstract question for me at the moment. So this maybe we could do a simulation like with a concrete topic sometimes I don't know in the future, but I would say there are two important things. First of all, what I already said, be transparent with what kind of information that is, where it is from, what studies are referred to in that article or whatever. And then I would also, um, of course, try to well, I think it's a question of giving an image about the diversity of perspectives, but still, I would also share where most of the consensus lies. For example, when it comes to scientific evidence, for example. So we also should not, in my opinion, put two different perspectives like on one level when we know that one is like what 90 experts say and the other one is like what one expert says. So there has to be some sort of information also about that. So where it's like what is evidence based and what's not. And I would really say what I would really say is in such a sensitive issue such as health, for example, we should really be careful of like sharing conspiracy theories, which we know are conspiracy theories. So I think there should be really a line. So, yeah.
Yeah, some of them, I suppose, are struggling with sifting through all of that information in the same way that their
Mm-hmm.
users would be. Um, but tools, then, I mean, I am a very enthusiastic health communication kind of guy. But in your perspective, is some of the challenge that we have before us is the um, medicine? Is that then more or better communication? Is that what we've been missing, or are we missing, in particular? I mean, more doctors, more nurses. What is do we have enough in communication, or is it it's just of a poor quality? Or um, I think you mentioned, without necessarily using the word anthropology before, that you would see that maybe some more anthropologists might not be a bad idea to engage in health communication or in digital health development, because that perspective would be beneficial too when we're talking about human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, in well, you're a communications kind of woman, and so would you say that this is something that we have that should be more of as well, or that that it's simply that we are communicating all we need, and maybe we should just dial it down a bit and think about quality instead?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think uh, health communication in general and digital health has to be interdisciplinary. So I completely agree to what you just said about also including other perspectives than like those of uh, physicians, medical experts, whatever. But what I would also say is that the question of communication in the health system, like doctor-patient communication, for example, um, has been an issue for like also before the pandemic, like also the interpersonal, the personal contact, personal communication is not free of hierarchy. So that has, and at least in Austria, we had that debate in the past. I'm not aware if we still have it, but at least we had it in the past, that medical students don't really learn very much about communicating with patients, which would be so important.
I would
Um,
be. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
so so I think that question was very relevant also like before the pandemic, and also before we talked about digital tools, but also when it comes to the personal individual contact. So I think that, for example, digital tools could be helpful when you want like to have some information, like when there are certain barriers and maybe you don't feel the hierarchy so much when you use digital means to communicate, and maybe also when you are able to communicate anonymously and ask your questions to a certain medical expert. But I also think that people working in the medical sector really need communicative skills. I don't dare to say better communicative skills, because I have always had good experiences with the medical doctors I had to deal with, but of communicative skills are obviously very necessary, indispensable, no matter if you talk face to face or if you talk virtually. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
One element that's been well, I've seen a lot of debate about, speaking
Mm-hmm.
of the face-to-face conversation, has been the use of recordings of doctor-patient conversations, either as a training mechanism um, for studying and quality improvement, or as a tool for the patient and in just sort of a second memory, or of course also proof of the quality of the treatment they received. Have you considered sort of the use also of such tools for improving the good old interpersonal communication?
Well, it's nothing I have thought about, to be honest, but I could
Ah,
imagine that, yeah, but I could imagine that it's an interesting idea. I think to like to use like some sort of archive, but that is also a question, of course, like you have to comply to privacy laws, for example, obviously. So that would
yeah,
open a
that would
complete new
be a
chapter.
given, yes. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
yeah, I just think that would really open a complete new, yeah, that would open up very many new questions then when we would
Well, it
like
does
to do that.
open up a lot of questions, but I think in a lot of what we've talked about so far today, we've talked about sort of the um, more passive providing of information, passing it on, making sure that it was available. But there's also, of course, either in the apps themselves or, as mentioned here, using digital recordings or digital
Hmm.
analysis of various kinds. There's also the element of using the digital tools as tools of research or tools of
Hmm.
quality improvement or others, which is a slightly different, more co-creative or responsive kind of way of
Hmm.
using the digital tools available to us. In that particular sense, the idea would, of course, be that um, as you have in most call centers, they record conversations between the customer
Hmm.
and the service provider, and they think essentially that if they analyze those calls, that they will actually be able to improve the quality of
Hmm.
those conversations. So the natural conclusion would be, maybe if you recorded conversations between doctors and patients, you could learn something about that. One specific example that I can give was actually a study done by the University of Copenhagen, where they had looked at the doctor-patient conversations on antibiotics, and they had an idea that most of those conversations would turn out to reveal that those patients were just asking for antibiotics again and again, wanting
Hmm.
a drug, a solution. But the analysis showed that in many cases the doctors themselves were actually maybe out of a get get out of my office kind of idea. They were prescribing the antibiotics quite soon, and maybe either because they had that mindset, or maybe because they assumed that the patient had the mindset and therefore jumped to the conclusion without actually listening to what they were saying. So the analysis of those conversations were quite interesting in terms of understanding the real patient-doctor interaction. Um, but yeah, okay, that's just an idea then for you
Yeah, it's. I
to
think it's
consider.
also really interesting. Also, of course, to use whatever we can get for analysis purposes and for getting more knowledge about also health topics. Um, uh, I just think that health is a really sensitive topic. So informed consent is maybe the key,
Mm,
and also
mm.
um,
But for you
making
as a
people aware
researcher,
how sensitive their information is actually. So yeah.
mm,
I mean,
but
I
still,
like to do social media analysis a lot, but for example, I use public forums for which I don't need any, I don't know, signing in or whatever. So I just use public forums, and I also, of course, anonymize. Like if there are clear names, for example, I would anonymize them. Um, but actually, I guess that would be what they do in that very interesting study as well. So yeah, but it's a question of informed consent, I would say.
probably mostly at least. But as you, for you as a researcher, of course, you're working with digital health because you find it appealing. I hope. But as you said, but clearly, I mean, it also provides you with a lot of um, opportunities that you wouldn't have available before. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
with the respect of anonymizing the data, or respecting the privacy of your research subjects. Still, this is, I mean, the amazing amount, either
Mm-hmm.
in the scale that you can do, or otherwise, um, which also then borders maybe for some of our digital developers on the value of having a lot of data. Um, would is that then something that you think, is this the dancing slightly with the devil? I mean, suddenly, by having all of that data available, um, is it an obligation for us to dive into the big data, or is it sort of just something that we should be much more careful about, trying to focus on? um, I know that the CPME, I mean the European Association for Doctors, that they are still promoting. I'm not sure that's the right word, but advocating the value of the good old face-to-face conversation, as opposed to a digital conversation. But obviously, in the good old face-to-face conversation, it's hard to gather data across different people. It has a different mechanism to it. Um, Whereas others would see, well, if we go digital, suddenly we have the big data. We can do AI, we can do machine learning, we can do a lot of those things. Um, but is this sort of just uh, a mirage of tech fascination, or it would, yeah?
I think it's a question of I think we should make use as independent researchers, like independent, I mean, we're not like obligated to like, we're not working in any company's interest, for example. So as academic researchers, for example, of course, we should make use of big data, the large corpus of data that is just there. It would be against our like um, our being as researchers not to make sense of all that data. Um, the question is always like for what and how. So what is the question behind it, and does it is it really for the like does it want to the research, does it want to do good for the people, or like what interest lies behind it? So I think we of course have to use it, but I think it doesn't replace the like talking to people in research, like with interviews, for example, or for doctors, like talking to their patients. So there cannot be it's a we can learn more. We can learn about knowledge repertoires out there, about certain health issues, about maybe information against every fact that is shared, so that we can react on that. Also, as for example, like medical doctors, things that they would like to react on. Um, so we can learn a lot from it, but I think it serves a different purpose than like really talking to individuals and getting to know them and their very personal like issues with health issues. So I think that's different layers maybe, um,
Mhm.
but both can complement each other very well, and it's always about gaining as much knowledge as possible. So there is no way, in my opinion, that we can ignore all these data that are out there,
Mhm.
given that we consider everything like that everything is ethical, like research ethical. That would be very
Mhm.
important for me.
Well, talking about talking to individuals, which borders, I suppose, also on engagement, using input from them, bordering maybe again on co-design, on co-creation, and so on.
Mhm.
One of the elements that we have explored in the Got-IT Toolkit is, of course, the value of of talking to your users, of using their input for your development process. Um, what's your key sort of take home messages, or maybe um, uh, realizations that you've had when talking to individuals, and having those sort of co-creative processes, that it's fun but rewarding, or that it's hard or tiring, or what have you seen as the main benefits of doing such processes?
Well, I've been it's quite a while ago. I've been working in like a very large European project about which was about social media monitoring in a migrant integration context, so a completely different field, but still very digital and very interdisciplinary. And I think my learning was especially so when it comes to participation, which I think is co-creation, which, as you say, which I also consider very important. That's definitely rewarding, I would say. But what is also a challenge in my experience is the different like the very different understandings and very different approaches to the same field by experts from different disciplines. So when, for example, in like very brief example, like a software engineer asks, well, what is technically possible? Let's just do that and see what's happening, and let's implement that. Social scientists would maybe ask before, why do we need that? Who do we address? What for? What's the purpose? Is that the way, like, so we ask the question first and then say, okay, and now let's try to develop and implement that in a certain way to achieve that goal. And I had the impression that IT like experts and software engineers are more like really into this developing. They just want to start from there, just see what's possible. So integrating those very different perspectives into one project, I think is really a challenge, but it's also very interesting. It's a very interesting challenge.
And
So
when you
yeah.
then, if you then also throw some end users into the mix,
Mhm.
is there then sometimes a risk of, I mean, the technical fascination, or the fascination by the social scientists, or the fascination from the doctor, this fascination, I mean, there's a lot of professional fascination of what you
Mhm.
can do when you have these end users in the room. Um, it's- is there sometimes a risk of all that curiosity killing the cat, of actually not really recognizing the input of the end user, or would you simply then also advise that you have a very controlled process of using the
Mhm.
end user feedback, or
Mhm.
how do you balance those different needs or interests or curiosities?
Yeah. I think the end user shouldn't just be like, or the end users shouldn't be the ones that like see like the project when it's already very far advanced and like, okay, here you have it, just test it and tell us what you think. But it should really be an iterative process. So they have to be integrated into this whole scenario as soon as possible. I would say when it comes to bringing up ideas, what do we actually need? We need also their experiences, I would say, because they have to work with those tools in the end. So they need to be like involved in the process from the very beginning, and then um, again and again and again in very regular stages of the process, I would say. So this is also what we know from Scrum processes in general. I think that is a very, very good way to make sure that their needs also, and I mean, those are the people who will in the end use a hopefully functioning tool. So to really involve them as soon as possible in the process. Yeah.
Would that be your sort of main advice for a digital developer? Involve your end user as soon as possible. Um, or
Yes, and yes,
yeah,
and think discipline and think interdisciplinary. That would
hmm.
be maybe the second one.
Two
Yeah.
good advice for digital developers. So if you had your wish sort of for either in terms of the future for digital health communication, what would be some of the hopes that you would see? More. I mean, right now I know that well, we all know that the European Union are looking very much into how they can improve not just digital health, but health research, health policy work, and so on. Um, More money, is that simply just good so that we can get going on doing more research, or would if you had your
Mhm.
pick, are we researching the right places? Are we using the resources then? Are you hopeful?
Yeah, I am very hopeful. More money is never wrong. I mean, and it's also, I'm very happy that also like digital tools, also in context to health, is very much in the minds, also like in the European context and in the policy context already. So that makes me quite hopeful for the future. But I also still think that the field of digital uh, health is a very complex one. And uh, I hope that this complexity will also be appreciated like in the future, because there are so many questions, and then we also have to see that when it comes let alone like the like health issues, what is health? I mean, it's physical health, it's mental health, there is so much about it, and then you have to like make the bridge to the digital aspect, which is opens up a whole new world again. So I think we're still in the process of defining what the field is actually, what it implies.
Hmm.
And here again, I would just really say, let's not forget that let's reach really out to the disciplines this field can really learn from or benefit from. So yeah, that's that's what I would consider important.
Just and I know, of course, that this is a huge question, but of course, there's short answers can be tricky to come up with. But um, are you seeing then also that digital health now is one of the tools to alleviate health inequalities, or are there a risk of them simply widening the gap?
Um, I think like the digital transformation in any context still raises the question of accessibility to everyone. I just read today a posting from the, I think it was the, I have it, the United Nations, that girls uh, face a distinct, I quote this, economic and social barriers to accessing the internet and digital devices. I mean, boys have much more higher numbers of like worldwide in having access to digital spheres. So of course we also have to think about that, and like the very basic question of who does not have access, because many people don't, for what reason ever. Or they just they're not capable of using, I don't know, the internet, or they just don't have access for any reason. So of course this is also something we have to work on. So let's not forget that.
Very good. Um, let's not forget that. True, there's still not nearly a decade of action left to reach the Sustainable Development Goals,
Mhm.
but at least there's still a huge chance that we'll make it. Thank you very much for joining me today, Emia, and I look forward to next week with another Got It Talks, and also to share more ideas about future research within digital health. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.